Thank you, and good morning to one and all. And may I, on behalf of the speakers today, also pay homage to the traditional owners of the land and their leaders, past and present, for allowing us to be at this venue. I'd also like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to share some thoughts with you this morning on the subject of international development, Asia and the Pacific. But I'll be taking a Pacific perspective. So tighten your seatbelts. We'll go for a trip around 7% of the world's surface in the Pacific. We are mostly sea, very few dots in the ocean. That's our land, and therefore my topic of small islands, except for Papua New Guinea, that's our large island. Major challenges, and how the Pacific might actually look at maximizing development effectiveness. Now, it's very difficult coming behind Alison, and I just said to her that she covered the whole of the world, and that was very good, putting the context. I'll be covering the Pacific, and my hope is that I'll make the Pacific bigger than the world, because that's really the area that I know a little bit about. But as a starter, the latest OECD DAC April 2013 report highlights that Oceania region, which is the 22 Pacific Island countries and territories, are the highest recipients of global development aid, about 5 times higher than Africa, and about 10 times more than the average for all developing countries. Now, that's quite a substantial thing that, legitimate questions will come up, such as, does the Pacific need any more aid? They already gold medalists, and so far ahead that it's very difficult for the silver medalists to catch up. And the other interesting question is, why is the Pacific not tracking too well in some of the global indicators, particularly such as the MDGs, despite the high investment in aid? Are there development outcomes that can be directly attributable to development assistance in the region? And what are they? How can we quantify those? And those are sort of the questions on the negative side. And I hope that during the next few minutes, I'll be sharing with you some of the reasons that underpin why it is that the Pacific has high per capita development aid allocation, and why they will still, for the foreseeable future, still rely on development assistance, particularly some more than others. I think also the theme for this conference is quite important, that it pulls together 2 regions that are greater in contrast than in similarities. The Asia is the development engine, and I think the paper fairly aptly summarizes Asia's growth as the largest global economic zone, and being able to look after its own poverty challenges. As we've heard last night, poverty challenges still remain within Asia, but the economic engine is greater, and the hope, of course, is that there could be rebalancing and equality of distribution of resources that will lift Asia even further up. The Pacific is very keen on Asia lifting further up, because as we've heard last night, Asia's focus on aid beyond its own borders is firstly to Asia. And if you look geographically, right next to the border is Pacific. And so we're quite keen for Asia to keep moving and then encompassing the Pacific as part of your boundary. Because the paper also says that for the Pacific, there is very different economic development prospects, and there is poverty of opportunities, and that is a truism in the Pacific. So I guess in the next few minutes, what I hope to share with you is just to share a little bit about the unique characteristics of the region, the island countries and territories, the challenges that they face, and therefore the small islands and the challenges. I'll dwell on that probably a little bit longer. And very quickly just run through my perceptions on the current aid architecture, what the future aid architecture could look like to be appropriate for the Pacific. A little bit about SouthSouth Cooperation, because I think that's very important for the Pacific, in particular as it relates to Asia. And finally, the question of where to from here. So for those that listened last night, this will be a bit of a bore for you, but the starting point for the Pacific is very simple. We live in a large ocean, 36 million square kilometers. Now, that's only about 12% of the whole Pacific Ocean. and it's only about 7% of the total Earth's surface. But it's big enough for us. It's 4 times the size of China. It's 20% larger than the continent of Africa. I think it's important just to put that into context, because in water, it's very difficult to go from country to country. We are a maritime region, and therein lies one of the biggest first challenges. It's geographical isolation, distant from markets, that makes it very difficult for the Pacific to be competitive. It's also very difficult to be competitive because most of the Pacific Island countries don't have tradable commodities. They are net importers. Few have commodities to export, so there is no real trade potential. About half our countries in the Pacific don't really have a private sector that will be able to engage and compete internationally. The private sector is useful to try and generate local survival and livelihood, and I think that's the first thing that they do, which brings the fact that it's very difficult for investors to come in and invest. The cost of business is very high. And I think these are some of the things that really makes the Pacific picture slightly more difficult. A question has been raised: why is it that Pacific Island countries are not performing as well as other small island states around the globe, like the Caribbean, for instance? And I think the answer is fairly simple: the distance from the market, the non-availability of tradable commodities, the high unit costs, and in the Pacific in particular, because we are a transshipment rather than an end destination port for shipping services, that we have to comply with International Maritime Organization rules like any other country. If our ports don't comply, ships don't come, and the Pacific's left out. So I think there are particular challenges for the Pacific that, in a sense, explains, if you like, the high level of development assistance coming through the Pacific. Another major challenge for the Pacific is that we have 22 island countries and territories, sovereign in their own right. Populations ranging from 66, that's smaller than a small village somewhere, of Pitcairn Island, to 6.5 million in Papua New Guinea. But I did comment that if these 22 countries were like provinces in a country, the picture is quite different. But they are sovereign countries. There are 22 administrations, and therefore supporting an ongoing government administration in those areas becomes an exercise that is actually quite difficult. And I think many of these countries do not have the natural resource capability to generate their own livelihood going on into the future. So let me just break down the Pacific picture a little bit more. It's convenient to put it in 3 subregions, and this is the Melanesia, the Polynesia, and the Micronesia. I usually talk about Evrenesia when I talk Pacific, but let's look at the 3. Melanesia, 5 countries, and these 5 countries, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, and Fiji, between them, they account for 98% of the total land resources in the Pacific. They account for 98% of all the land-based resources, terrestrial minerals, and they account for only 28% of the EEZ, of the 36 million square kilometers, the smaller bit. But the difference is that smaller bit of ocean also holds the world's richest tuna fisheries. It also holds for the Pacific their richest underwater sea minerals. So I guess the question there is that these 5 countries, in time, would actually be able to develop to such an extent that their reliance on external assistance might decrease, and some of them might actually graduate. Papua New Guinea, for instance, and New Caledonia. New Caledonia is where I live. Population 250,000. They have the same GDP as Papua New Guinea, 6.5 million. Why? Because they got the largest nickel mine in the world. They have stock for another 150 years. So I guess there are countries in the Pacific over time that will graduate. Then we go to Micronesia. Small Nesia. There are 7 countries, and between them, a total land area of 3,000 square kilometers. Quite small. The smallest of them is 21 square kilometers, and that's Nauru. But these countries have a total population of just under 600,000 now. 50 years from now, total population of about 1.2 million. So I guess this is quite important in projecting aid now and aid in 50 years. If they're struggling now, what happens then? And these countries don't really have as much natural resources. What they have is the sea. But their part of the sea doesn't have too much of the tuna, except in about 20 years when climate change actually shifts tuna stock eastwards. So the western side of the Pacific, Papua New Guinea, Solomons, will have a reduction of tuna as a result of climate change and ocean warming and currents. And the middle Pacific and eastern Pacific will have the richer tuna. What does that mean? Is that countries in the middle and eastern Pacific can actually start thinking about investment on how they can make use of the resource that's coming. And I call the tuna the last gold mine of the Pacific. Once this goes, that's it. We are just with our ocean. Polynesia, 10 countries, and between them, 8,000 square kilometers. You'll be bored with these figures, but I'll come back to why it's important. And the smallest of those is 5 square kilometers. It's a country. The next smallest is 12 square kilometers. It's a country of 3 villages, 3 atolls. And atolls is important. That's a feature of life in the Pacific. It's important because they are very vulnerable to climatic events. And if we project 100 years from now, and if we look at the IPCC report that was out, and they have said that they were based on assumptions that were not as accurate as they could have been, so the impact would actually be a lot worse, then we could probably imagine that in 100 years, some of these countries will be barely surviving. So the question then happens, what happens to Pacific populations then? I think the real issue facing many of the Pacific countries now, thinking 100 years, is what will happen to our people when these things happen. So if we put the Micronesian and Polynesian countries together, 17 of them, they have a total land area that is smaller than the smallest of the Melanesian countries. That's Vanuatu. And I think the issue there for me is when we talk about the natural capacity of the country to generate its own resources going forward, it's got to be based on the natural resources that it has, on the human capital that it has, and the potential for opportunity going forward. And this then paints the picture for me that it's very difficult for some of these countries that don't have the resources now to project a way forward, that they will suddenly have resources and therefore are suddenly not reliant on development aid going forward into the future. That is the reality that we have to live with in some of these countries. And the reality as to why this voice of concerns about climate change comes up every time, because the countries are saying, we are not party to greenhouse emissions, but we are subject to other people's goodwill and or lack of goodwill for our survival into the future. And I think that's a very, very important issue that Pacific Islands are struggling with. So let me just pose a few other areas. MDGs, how is the Pacific tracking? Surprisingly, MDG 2, we're tracking reasonably well on a country average. If we look at the region and we say 22 countries, we're not bad. When we look at the number of children, we are not doing as well. Why? Because Papua New Guinea and Solomons, where most of the children are, actually pulling us down as a region. And I think sometimes generalizing tracking by regional doesn't do justice to the problems and inequities that are there. For the other MDG indicators, some countries in Polynesia are tracking reasonably well, but as a region, I don't think the Pacific will actually meet up with all the MDG indicators by 2015. So it's going to be a struggle moving forward. Climate change and climate variability, I've mentioned a little bit, and Alison did mention that. And disaster risk, we're very prone to disasters. And this is where development assistance has, in fact, assisted the Pacific, both in terms of coordinating frameworks at national level as well as regional level to pull together. One of the successful stories in the Pacific is success regional cooperation. We had a recent review of the SPC that was done last year. And one of the coins they phrased that I loved is the law of diminishing country size. That as the size of the country diminishes, and they're already small, so they go into tiny, as the size diminishes, the need for a regional framework of cooperation increases. And for many of these countries in the Pacific, that regional cooperation is not an option, it's an imperative, because without it, they can't survive as individual countries. And one of the things I think the Pacific is now struggling with, or has been struggling with, is the balance between sovereignty as an island country and shared sovereignty that brings in the picture of, yes, we are still sovereign countries, but we acknowledge the fact that on our own we cannot survive long into the future. We need each other, and therefore going into that kind of a sphere. But politics, what it is, the word sovereign is a very important one, and sometimes stifles a good commonsensical way to move forward. Even if I'm a country of 10,000 people, I'll stick with my country, and I'll move on and try to look at every development assistance coming in as through a bilateral arrangement. And that is an interesting feature because multi-country assistance that takes into account shared sovereignty is actually conned upon as competing for bilateral resources. It undermines sovereignty. And one of the things that I think needs a shift in thinking, a paradigm shift, is that Pacific Island countries need to acknowledge these two avenues through which assistance come in are part and parcel of the same solution, that one is not competing against the other. And the more we continue to say, they are competing and undermine sovereignty, the more we are realizing that the solution is not going to be full for each of those countries. And I think flexibility amongst the Pacific leadership is something that we really need to look forward to and work towards. Inequality, I think, came up yesterday, and I think Alison mentions that. For the Pacific context, when we look at the subregions, Melanesia has a lot more of that, particularly when it comes to gender. Gender representations in Parliament in the Pacific generally is very low, less than 10%, but in Melanesia is even lower. So I think we have a long way to go, and I think development assistance also through support of governments, civil society, to try and put gender up on the scale has actually helped in some areas. However, there's still a long way to go when we actually look at gender. And one of the issues, and I think Australia, the Prime Minister has announced last year at the Forum Leaders meeting a huge initiative on gender for Pacific. And I think that's a very, very important initiative. I think the key to getting a success in the initiative such as that is really how do we target it for best impact? Who do we target? And for me, targeting the women is very, very good. It's very important, but that's not where the problem is. The problem is with the men, and they are not targeted. So I think the issue is, for me, to have full benefits of a huge investment such as that. We need to start to break down the cultural issues that actually stand in the way of integrating gender. It's quite common for some parts of the Melanesian Pacific to think that women should not really be in Parliament. And I think it's very important that when we look at gender, it is not that men are the bad guys. I think, and I've got to make that clear, it is that men need as much education about the value of involving and lifting gender up the scale as any other development aspect. And if we look, for instance, in a country, and in the Pacific, it's roughly 50-50 women and men, it's like driving a 6-cylinder car down the road and with only 3 cylinders working. Just imagine what happens if the other 3 cylinders are actually working as well. The car moves a lot faster. And I think for me, the whole issue of gender is that if we continue to invest either on one and not both, we might not get the full benefits of what we're looking for. Another challenge in the Pacific is the development partners coming in, the emerging donors and the traditional donors. The traditional donors, we know the story, and I think that's not a problem. The emerging donors come into the scene, and I think the whole issue that Alison mentioned, that these countries do have a choice, based on what they have a look at. It's quite interesting because from a country perspective, although development assistance might be seen as quite large for the Pacific, from a country perspective, there are huge unmet needs. And for them, sometimes of higher priority. And countries can actually look at playing the jigsaw puzzle. And sometimes getting funds in is not difficult. It is the basis of how the funds come in, how they then actually spread across the whole development agenda for the country. That's where the difficulty lies. And I think that brings into, I guess, question the Paris Declaration, the Accra Agenda for Action, the Busan Partnership for Development Coordination, because it's not the lack of principles, they're already there. The Pacific is actually well ahead because they have 3 other declarations themselves. The Pacific Plan for strengthening cooperation. They also have the Pacific Principles of Aid Effectiveness, 2007, and they have the Keynes Compact for Development Coordination in 2009. So instead of 3, we have 6. And I think the whole issue for the Pacific is really then to have a look at and use the principles to be able to plan what is it that the country wants to be 20, 30, 40 years from now. A lot of planning, I think, can be improved by asking a simple, holistic question. It is not about what do I need the development partner to fund for now, for the next 5 years. It should be how does that fit into the bigger picture of contributing to where the country should be 50 years from now. And I think that discussion needs to happen at the Pacific level, but very importantly, it needs to happen between Pacific and development partners level. And there I say, very important between development partners themselves. Because whilst the principles exist, and whilst development partners try to work together in some of the Pacific countries, there are some that prefer to go it alone. And that undermines their own, if you like, integrity as a group of partners with a genuine concern to assist the developing country. So will the Pacific be totally reliant on aid forever? I would hope that many of the countries will graduate and be able to do most of the things themselves. But I think there will be a few countries in which development assistance will become a permanent feature. And I think that then calls for a change in mindset in discussing and talking about aid. This is really looking at a shift. Because for these countries, the question is no longer going to be how long do we continue to provide aid, how much and for what. If we know these countries are going to be dependent on aid for as long as they're going to be there, the question really should be, is there another way in which aid could be termed that does not blow out of proportion the aid per capita for that country, but these countries could actually then be looking at the longer-term development partnership framework, some sort of a compact. And I use the term, for instance, if I was to come back to Australia, Norfolk Island is an island out there that is part of Australia. Australia's contribution to Norfolk Island is not considered aid because it is part of Australia. And I guess the question I'm looking at is for countries that we know that will continue to require development assistance going forward, is there a mechanism that will allow that kind of an area or that kind of consideration? Now, the president of Kiribati on climate change has been the most active and most provocative in his international statements. He has mentioned the term climate change refugees. They're asking the question, what will happen to a population if sea level rise comes to such a stage that some of our countries disappear? And for many of you, why should some of these countries disappear? Because some of them, the highest point above sea level at low tide is 2 meters. And at high tide, the sea level comes into the airstrips. So the reality for them is that any significant rise in sea level is actually going to be disastrous for them as a nation, as a country, as people. And I think the whole issue then raises the concept of beyond aid. It is a different discussion. And I think that's one of the things that would be very useful to actually go into that kind of discussion, because it addresses some of the very key concerns, not just for now. We have enough problems for now, but project them 50 years from now, and I think those concerns are even worse for some of these countries. So I guess the whole point of what should aid look like in the Pacific going forward, I'd probably say the current architecture is built around the premise of individual countries driving a development agenda priority and reciprocal, if you like, arrangement from development partners that responds to that, and the partnership is bilateral one, mostly. In addition to that, I think we need to have a look at an aid where we consider the concept of shared sovereignty, where for some countries, some of the development outcomes are better achieved through a multi-country program. Now, this may not be applicable for larger countries and other countries in the world, but for the Pacific, it is very applicable. And I think the aid architecture in the Pacific need to formalize that rather than have it as an additional option. It needs to be mainstreamed as one of the key principles of future aid architecture. And I think there needs to be a third component going forward, and that is a third component based on the realization that some of these countries will not be able to, for as long as they are there, survive on their own, where aid becomes a permanent feature of their development program. And I think for those groups, the discussion about what kind of terminology needs to be given to the support so that it's not considered aid, but probably more a long-term development partnership framework. Because I think for these countries, the last thing they need is to actually say, well, this country is already at $237 per capita on aid. If we increase it, they're going to $500 per capita for aid. It doesn't look very good for the people in that country to be regarded as very high per capita aid recipients, when in actual fact their livelihood actually depends on some basic humanitarian acknowledgement that they are where they are because that's where God puts their country to be, and unfortunately for them, they are citizens of those countries. And I think it's very important that the future architecture of aid in the Pacific takes into account these three things, because it's quite different from each of them. I'm speaking like a preacher now, so I'd better move on to South-South Cooperation. I've spoken mostly about the Pacific because, in a sense, I tried to make the Pacific bigger than the world. But I think the potential for Pacific to be part of Asia-Pacific, and I used to say in some quarters that we need a microscope, an electron microscope, to see the P beside the A. Because Asia-Pacific, it's convenient from a perspective of global geographical location for the region. But in terms of benefits by being put as part of Asia, is very quickly the focus is on Asia. And the Pacific falls into insignificance. And I think that's very important for us to sort of realize that there are pros and cons by being grouped with the powerhouse, which is going to be the world's leading economic zone going into the future. But there are huge advantages that have not been tapped between Pacific and Asian countries themselves. Most of the tradable goods that come into the Pacific are from Asia. And the shipping routes coming in west eastwards. So there's already a connection on economic trade support to the region. I think it's also important that there are institutions on both sides, the ASEAN and the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, the SPC, the organization I work for, have already established informal linkages. This could be actually stepped up and led to other corporations. Asian institutions already provide training venues for many of Pacific Island people to develop human capital. And I think there is great opportunity for individual countries in the Pacific to link up with countries in Asia to sort of formalize areas for South-South cooperation. So I think there are great opportunities there that go beyond money, that builds capital, that actually builds capacity. And I think that's a potential that Pacific has, and I think Asia can provide some benefits too for the Pacific. So where to from here? I guess in summary, the Pacific has benefited enormously on development assistance. Some countries, over time, in particular, the 5 Melanesian countries has the greatest potential. In Polynesia, probably 3 countries have good potential, Samoa, Tonga, and Cook Islands. In Micronesia, we probably have 1 or 2 countries with good potential. These countries, as a group, might actually be able to move along the less reliance part on development aid going into the future. Some of them might actually be able to be little donors themselves from within the Pacific context. But for the other group, they will continue to rely on aid, not to an extent where it's over the long term. So I think there is a balance of how much aid, how it is focused, which countries participate. But there are a few countries where aid will actually be a permanent feature of their development agenda. And I think for these countries, it needs to be a separate discussion on going forward as to how those would be addressed. I think the other issue with the Pacific is we as a region need to get our act together and fairly clearly define in order to determine what arm or mechanism of aid comes in. We need to determine which development outcomes are best addressed bilaterally. That then respects the sovereignty, individual country sovereignty. We also need, in parallel, to determine which development outcomes are best addressed through multi-country approaches, and that then determine the shared sovereignty. And I think if we then put those two together, it will, in a sense, define or quantify both the quantum of aid, where it's coming from, how it's going to be delivered. And I think that provides a slightly better picture from the Pacific perspective. On the other end of the equation, the question for development partners would be, are they in a position to apply the principles of Paris Declaration and actually support the development outcomes as proposed by countries in a coordinated manner. The next question is, if there was this issue of maintaining the current aid architecture of bilateral and adding to it a component of the multi-country, are they prepared to play that game with the Pacific countries? So I guess going forward, some of these countries do have resources that I think they themselves would be proud to stand on their own and have less reliance on aid. And there are some, of course, that will continue to permanently rely on development assistance. Fewer rather than more, but there will be some. So ultimately, I think it comes back to political decisions and political leadership at each of these countries. And I guess the important thing for the political level is to think outside the box. There need to be a paradigm shift, both from the development partner perspective as well as from the country perspective on how best to move forward. And I think the most important question that we need to pose and maybe reflect on in a meeting such as this is what kind of a Pacific region do we want to see? If I was speaking for the Pacific Island leaders, I would be saying, what kind of a country do we want to see 50 years from now? And come back and say, well, where are we now? And where is the gap? How big is that gap? And how do we fill that gap, both with resources, human capital, and other things? And is it achievable? And do we need help to move forward? And I think these are the key questions that need to be asked at the Pacific level. But at a meeting like this, I think for those of you that have been involved in the Pacific, have seen it grow and move forward, is there an opportunity there for Pacific that actually looks better than what it is? Tourist operators are very smart in putting up, come to the sunshine, come to the nice beaches and all that in the Pacific. And yes, it's beautiful. But how much longer can that beauty be sustained going forward into the future? Because below the beauty, there are real challenges out there. So what kind of a Pacific do we want to see? And how can we help put a process in place that helps these countries to actually take charge of planning their own aid agenda, their own future, and then development partners can be part of the process of helping them achieve that. So I guess the final point for me would be, if we were to make some sort of commentary that is going to be useful in informing policy, in informing directions, what kind of a legacy does a group like this leave behind to try and contribute to that? If we turn that question around, how would we want to be remembered by the future generations as think tankers, as policy influencers, and mobilizers of ideas and resources to try and input into the planning that will help safeguard people of the Pacific in the future? Thank you.